Hello everyone, welcome to my channel Middleware Technologies. Today we will be looking at how we can set up OpenLDAP based authentication and authorization in Apache HTTP server. So here in this video, we will try to set up OpenLDAP based authentication and authorization in Apache HTTP server in order to secure content for two website customers or content. So let us see how we can achieve that in this video. So coming to my test environment, I have a Fedora operating system on top of which we will be installing the Apache HTTP server, and we'll be using the OpenLDAP version 2 in order to provide us with the LDAP users for authentication. Now let us try to understand about the Apache mod underscore auth nz underscore LDAP module. So basically, this is a LDAP module that supports both authentication and authorization features. So it is both authentication and authorization provider. So that is why the name is auth nz. So it allows an LDAP directory to be acting as a store to store the database for the HTTP basic authentication. So basically, it contains the credentials for the users who will be authenticated using this LDAP database. So this module allows authentication frontends such as auth basic, modern auth basic to authenticate users to a LDAP directory. So basically, in this LDAP, how the authentication works is the mod underscore auth nz LDAP searches for an entry in the directory. So basically, it tries to look for an entry for the username in the LDAP DIT tree, and if it finds a unique match, then it attempts to bind to the directory using that DN of the entry and the password that has been provided by the HTTP client. So this is basically our search and bind process. So that is why it does a search and then bind, and it is often referred to as search bind phase. Okay, so authentication phase is also known as search bind phase in the OpenLDAP service. So for more details, you can just go through the mod underscore auth nz underscore LDAP documentation, which will provide you with more information and more examples on how you can configure this module. Now, this video or this article is basically a continuation to our previous article, wherein we have seen how we can set up name-based virtual hosting in Apache HTTP server. Okay. Now let us look at the high-level architecture that we are going to implement in this video. So this is, as I said, it is a continuation to our name-based virtual host. So here, we have a single Apache HTTP server with an IP address which will be routing to the appropriate virtual host based on the host header that is sent in the request, and this request is further is going to be authenticated using the OpenLDAP service, which holds the credentials for the user. So we will be using OpenLDAP as an authentication and authorization backend for our clients who are trying to access this virtual host content. Now let us look at the procedure of how we can implement it in Apache HTTP server. So for this, first we need to ensure that, as a step one, ensure that the LDAP module is installed. So by default, the Apache HTTP server does not have the LDAP module installed on the server to support the LDAP based authentication and authorization. So for that, what we need to do is we are going to create a new role, that is Linux underscore install underscore prerequisite, which we will be using to install the prerequisite packages for setting up the LDAP based authentication and authorization in Apache HTTP server. So let me show you my Ansible project, which we'll be using to set up our Apache HTTP server. So in that, let us now go to the install prerequisites role, and here, like you can see, like we are installing the mod underscore LDAP module as a part of this role. So for now, like you can ignore the mod underscore auth underscore open IDC, which we'll be looking at in the later video. So for now, like we will be installing the mod underscore LDAP module. So once the remote Apache HTTP server on the remote Apache HTTP server, it is going to install the modules at the following location as shown below. So basically, so once so let me install. So let me go and install my module. So for that, what we need to do is we need to run our install prerequisites. So this is the command that we will be running. Basically install prerequisites, so which will install the mod underscore LDAP module on the remote server. So the module is already installed, so nothing to do. So once that is installed, you can go to the remote server and do rpm-ql with the name of the module. So this is the module that we are going to list, like to see like what are the files that are extracted on the file system. So as you can see, like we have this config, that is LDAP config. The that one we can refer to see like how we can configure the LDAP authentication authorization, which is available in the config on .modules.d directory. And you can also see that these are the two modules that are available or installed into the HTTP modules location, which will be used for authentication and authorization process. Okay, so let me now go to my documentation again. So now we have installed our prerequisite packages, and we have seen the module that has been installed on our machine. Now let us go to our next step, that is ensure that Open LDAP service is running. Okay, so for this, like we will be using a Docker Compose file with a very basic setup for Open LDAP service. And let me show you that Docker Compose file first. So this is the Docker Compose file that we are using in order to set up our Open LDAP service. And this is the image that I am going to use. And these are the ports that I am going to expose. We are customizing these ports for the HTTP and HTTPS connection, but we will be using only for one. So I'll be using the 1389 port for HTTP on the host machine, which will be like forwarding to the 1389 port in the Docker container for OpenLDAP service. Okay, and these are the important variables that we are setting in this Docker Compose file. So wherein we are creating an admin user for our DIT tree with the following password, and our DIT tree root is going to be stack.com. So this is the LDAP root under which the LDAP user, that admin, is going to be created. And we are going to further create LDAP user 1 and LDAP user 2 also with the following passwords, that is LDAP password 1 and LDAP password 2, which will be going to be under this root directory. And this is the LDAP admin DN, Basically this is the DN that is going to be we will be using in order to bind with the LDAP server. And this is the default network that we are going to create for this Open LDAP service. So as you can see, it is using the driver as bridge, and we are going to map the Open LDAP data uh, on the local with the following directory to this directory in the container. And we are using this volume Open LDAP data as driver type local. So this is very basic example that we are using for setting up the Open LDAP service. So now we have seen it the Docker Compose file, and we have understood about the LDAP service that we are going to set up. Now let us try to start up the Open LDAP service using the Docker Compose command. So let me go to my workstation, and let me ensure that I have the Docker service started. And now I will be using the Docker Compose up -d to start up the Open LDAP service. So once the LDAP service is running, we can validate the DIT tree structure for our LDAP server using the following command from our workstation. So let me copy this command. So here we are using the LDAP search utility in order to connect to our LDAP server with the host ldap:// fedser.stack.com and 1389 as the port from the workstation. Like we are connecting with the workstation name and host, which is mapping to that Docker container wherein the LDAP service is running. And this is the base DN which under which we are going to do a search, and this is the bind DN that is we are using the admin user, and this is going to we are going to pass a password for that one, and we are trying to search for all the entries with object class star. Let us try to enter the password for this admin user, that is admin@1234, and it is going to provide us with the whole directory structure, wherein you can see this is the stack.com, that is our root domain, and under which we have organization unit as OU users, which will contain our users LDAP user 1 with the password which is base64 encoded, and we have LDAP user 2 that is also having a password with base64 encoded. And we have a readers group under the OU users, which has these two members, that is LDAP user 1 and LDAP user 2. So this is the very basic LDAP service that we have brought up using the Docker Compose file. Now let us go to our next step, that is step 3, updating the virtual host configuration. So here what we are going to do is we are going to update our virtual host configuration for customer 1 and customer 2 to enable authentication, basic authentication and authorization using the LDAP service. So we are going to set up the LDAP URL along with the LDAP server bind DN and bind password using the directives auth LDAP URL, auth LDAP bind DN, and auth LDAP bind password. And once the LDAP user is authenticated, the authorization check is done using the required directive, wherein the users in the LDAP group named readers are only allowed to access the protected resource. So this is the configuration that we are going to use. So let me copy this thing for customer 1 and let me update it in the, so I'll close all these things. Let me go to Linux configure files customer 1, and here in the virtual host section, like I'm going to append this data wherein we are going to secure this location wherein we have secure content using authentication type basic, which will provide a basic authentication page. And in the backend, like we are going to use the LDAP as the authentication provider, and this is the LDAP authentication LDAP URL to which we are going to bind using this bind DN and bind password. And once the user authenticates, the user needs to be a valid user, LDAP user, that is LDAP user one, that we are trying to check using this require authorization. And this is another check that we can do. Basically, the user should be a group, a tab group with the following DN, which we can further check later on. So for now, let me comment this one. And for customer 2 also, like we need to copy the data. So let me copy that section for customer 2. So this line needs to be commented. Now, like here also, like we are going to secure the location with content with slash secure with the authentication type as basic and authentication basic provider as LDAP. And this is the LDAP URL, LDAP bind DN with which it is going to be bind, and this is the LDAP bind DN password. And we are going to validate with the following authorization whether if the LDAP user is LDAP user 2. So basically, like for customer 1, we should be able to authenticate with only LDAP user 1, and for customer 2, we should be able to authenticate and access only with LDAP user 2. So now we have looked at our configuration. Now let us go to our next step, that is step 4, update the LDAP setup HTTP playbook. So here, like we are going to add the additional role that we have created, that is Linux install prerequisites. So this is the role that we are going to include in our Linux setup HTTP .yaml file with the following tag. And once that is done, you can just update your readme instructions also to include this instruction to execute this following the rule, that is a Linux install prerequisites. So this is as a part of step 5. Now once the step 5 update readme.md file is done, like we will be able to execute the Linux install prerequisite role that we have already completed in order to check what is the module that is getting installed on the remote server and what are the file content that are extracted on the remote server. So we will ignore this step, that is Linux install prerequisite, because that is already installed. So now, like once that is done, in the step 7, what we need to do is execute linux configure underscore httpd role, wherein we will be using updating the customer 1 and customer 2 config data by executing this role. So let us try to execute this role in order to upload our content onto the remote server. So here I'm using the linux underscore setup underscore httpd playbook and I'm trying to execute the linux underscore configure underscore httpd role in order to update my customer's virtual host configuration. So now my virtual host configuration for customer 1 is updated and virtual host configuration for customer 2 is updated. And if you go and look at the remote server, it is going to be present at the following location: where opt config customer1 customer1.config file. So this is the configuration for LDAP authentication and authorization, and this is the let me show you the customer 2 configuration. So this is the configuration for LDAP configuration, authentication authorization configuration for customer 2. Okay, now once the configuration is updated, the next step is restart the Apache HTTPD service. So for that we will be using two roles to restart the service. So first we will be stopping the service using linux underscore stop underscore HTTPD. So let me stop this. And now let us try to start the Apache HTTP service for the changes to take effect. So the Apache HTTP service is started. Now the next step is step 9, validate the LDAP secured applications. So this is step 9, wherein we will try to access the virtual host secure content using LDAP user credentials. Okay, so now first let me try to access the customer1.linuxserver stack.com secure content, that is secure.html file, using the LDAP user 1 and LDAP password 1. So by default, the customer for customer 1, the LDAP user 1 is allowed access. So we will be able to get the hello customer 1. This is your secure page. But if you try to access it using the LDAP user 2, you will be not able to access it, as it is not authorized to access the customer 1's secure data. So this is the 401 unauthorized error that you are going to get it. Now let me clear my screen and let us copy the curl command for second customer. So for the second customer, so let me remove this -i, like we will try to look at the complete response. Like we are just not going to use the header, that -i. So here, like for the customer to secure content, that is this location, like we are trying to access using LDAP user 1 with LDAP password 1, which will not be able to access it because they are not authorized to access it. But now if you try to access it using the LDAP user 2, you should be able to get the content for that secure.html page. So this is how, like, you will be able to restrict access to your secure content using the LDAP authentication authorization. And one more thing that I wanted to show you. So let's say, like, if you want to uh, uh, ensure the group level access is provided. So let me update this, comment out this required LDAP user line and enable this LDAP group line, wherein we are trying to allow access to the secure content for all the users in this readers group. So we will be enabling this line for each customer. Or let's say, like we will enable it for only the customer 1, so that both LDAP user 1 and LDAP user 2 will be able to authenticate. So let me update the configuration for this first. So we'll run the LDAP configure HTTPD in order to update our configuration for customer 1. Once the configuration has been updated, let us stop the HTTP service. The Service is started. Now let us try to start the HTTP service. So let me minimize all these things. So now the updated configuration is available. So now ideally the customer wants secure data should be available for access by both LDAP user 1 and LDAP user 2. So let me do it customer1.linuxserver.stack.com /secure/secure.html file. Let us try to access it with first LDAP user 1. You will be able to access it. Now let us try to access the same thing using LDAP user 2, and you should be able to access the customer data. So this is how like you will be able to modify or update your LDAP configuration for the customers as per your requirement and do the authentication and authorization. So that is all I wanted to show you in this video. Thank you all. Thanks for watching this video, and you guys have a great day.